The dust cloud rising behind Grace Dalton's wagon was the only thing connecting her to the world she was leaving behind. And as she looked back one last time at the Missouri horizon, she wondered if independence was supposed to feel this much like loneliness. It was 1876, and Grace had spent the last 3 weeks traveling westward with nothing but a stubborn mule, a wagon full of her dead aunt's belongings, and a deed to land she had never seen in a place called Jerome, Arizona Territory. The lawyer back in St. Louis had handed her the paperwork with sympathetic eyes, explaining that her Aunt Martha had died suddenly, leaving Grace her only living relative and sole beneficiary of a small property out west. At 23 years old, with no family left in Missouri, and a broken engagement to a banker's son who decided a woman with opinions was unsuitable for marriage, Grace had seen the deed as a sign from God Himself that her life was meant for something more than sitting in parlors and pretending to be less intelligent than she was. The journey had been harder than she imagined. She had joined a wagon train heading to California, but they had parted ways in New Mexico Territory when the trail boss refused to make a detour south toward Arizona. He had looked at her like she was mad when she insisted on continuing alone, but Grace had inherited her aunt's stubbornness along with her property, and she would not be deterred by the doubts of men who thought women incapable of deciding their own destinies. Now, as her wagon creaked along the rutted trail through the high desert country of Arizona Territory, Grace was beginning to understand why the trail boss had looked so concerned. The landscape was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, all red rocks and scrub brush and endless sky. But it was also isolating. She had not seen another human being in 2 days, and her water was running lower than she would have liked. The map she carried showed Jerome as a mining town in the mountains, but the distances on paper meant nothing when translated to the actual miles of rough terrain. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Grace noticed the change in her mule's gait. Bessie was limping, favoring her left front leg, and when Grace climbed down to investigate, her heart sank. The mule had thrown a shoe, and the hoof looked tender. Grace was no farrier, but she knew enough to understand that pushing Bessie much further could lame the animal permanently. She stood in the middle of the empty trail, looking in all directions and seeing nothing but wilderness. The smart thing would be to make camp here and hope that Bessie's hoof would improve with rest, but they were exposed on this open stretch, and Grace had heard enough stories about bandits and hostile encounters to know that being visible and alone was dangerous. To the north, perhaps a mile distant, she could see what looked like a break in the landscape where trees grew thicker. Where there were trees, there was usually water, and where there was water, there might be people. Grace made her decision quickly, unhitching Bessie from the wagon and leading the mule slowly toward the green patch on the horizon, leaving the wagon behind with the intention of retrieving it once she found help. The walk took longer than expected, and by the time Grace reached what turned out to be a creek running through a small canyon, the sun was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She let Bessie drink and was filling her own canteen when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Grace's hand instinctively went to the rifle she carried, but before she could raise it, a voice called out from above her on the canyon rim. "I would not do that if I were you, miss. I am friendly, but my ranch hands might not take kindly to seeing their boss threatened." Grace looked up to see a man on horseback silhouetted against the sunset. He was tall in the saddle, wearing a hat that had seen better days and sitting with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in this landscape. As he guided his horse down the slope toward her, Grace kept her hand near the rifle but did not draw it. When he reached the canyon floor, she could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 30 years old, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly where it touched his collar. His eyes were an unusual shade of blue-green, like the shallow parts of a river, and they assessed her with intelligence and curiosity rather than threat. "You are a long way from anywhere," he said, dismounting. "Frank Dawson. I own the Triple D Ranch about 3 miles west of here." "Grace Dalton," she replied, lifting her chin. "I am heading to Jerome. My mule threw a shoe." Frank looked at Bessie, then at Grace, then back toward the direction she had come from. "Your wagon," about a mile back. "I did not want to lame my mule by making her pull it on that hoof." "Smart," Frank said, and there was approval in his voice that made Grace feel both pleased and irritated. She did not need this stranger's approval. "But Jerome is still a good 30 miles from here, much of it mountain road. You will not make it alone, not with a lame mule and no wagon." "I will manage," Grace said stiffly. "I have managed this far." Frank was quiet for a moment, studying her in a way that made Grace acutely aware of how she must look after weeks on the trail, dusty and tired and probably half wild herself. Then he said something she did not expect. "I am not doubting your capability, Miss Dalton. I am stating a fact. Those mountains eat travelers who are not prepared. I have found enough bones over the years to know." He paused. "My ranch is close. You and your mule can rest there tonight, and in the morning I will take you to retrieve your wagon, and we will see about getting you and your belongings where you need to go." Grace wanted to refuse. She had left Missouri precisely to escape from depending on others, from being told what she could and could not do. But she was also practical enough to know that pride had killed plenty of people in this territory, and Frank Dawson did not have the look of a man who meant her harm. "I can pay for the accommodation," she said finally. Something that might have been amusement flickered across Frank's face. "I am not running a hotel, Miss Dalton. I am offering hospitality. You can accept it or not, but I am not going to charge you for basic human decency." That stung, though Grace was not entirely sure why. She nodded shortly. "Then I accept. Thank you." Frank helped her gather her things, then boosted her up onto his horse behind him while he led Bessie carefully along the creek bed toward his ranch. Grace had to hold onto his waist to keep her balance, and she was uncomfortably aware of the solid warmth of him, the way he smelled of leather and sage, and something else she could not quite identify. She had not been this close to a man since her broken engagement, and that had been different, stilted and proper, and lacking entirely in whatever this crackling awareness was. The Triple D Ranch appeared out of the gathering darkness like something from a dream. It was bigger than Grace had expected, with a sprawling ranch house built of adobe and timber, several outbuildings, and corrals that held more horses than she could count in the fading light. Dogs came running to greet them, and Frank spoke to them softly in a way that made Grace think he was probably kinder than his weathered exterior suggested. A man emerged from the barn, older and bow-legged, with a face like tanned leather. "Boss," he said, then saw Grace and raised his eyebrows. "Company, this is Miss Grace Dalton. She is heading to Jerome but ran into some trouble. She will be staying in the guest room tonight. Can you see to her mule? Threw a shoe and the hoof is tender." The older man nodded. "I will fix her right up. Name's Pete, miss. Welcome to the Triple D." Frank helped Grace down from the horse with hands that were gentle but impersonal, then led her toward the house. Inside was cleaner and more comfortable than she had expected from a bachelor rancher. The main room had a large fireplace, furniture that was practical but well made, and windows that would let in plenty of light during the day. There were books on shelves, which surprised her, and the kitchen area looked well equipped. "Guest room is through there," Frank said, pointing to a door off the main room. There is a wash basin and clean water. I imagine you would like to freshen up before dinner." "I do not want to impose," Grace started, but Frank waved her off. "You are not imposing. I do not get much company out here, and most of it is ranch hands who smell worse than the cattle. Having someone civilized at my table will be a pleasant change." He paused. "I am going to check on the horses. Make yourself comfortable." Grace found the guest room to be simple but clean, with a real bed covered in a quilt that looked handmade and a window that faced west toward the darkening mountains. She washed her face and hands, braided her long brown hair more neatly, and changed into a dress that was only slightly less dusty than the one she had been wearing. When she emerged, Frank was at the stove, cooking something that smelled unexpectedly good. "I hope you like steak," he said without turning around. "It is about all I know how to cook well, but I do it very well." "I like steak," Grace said, moving to the table. She felt awkward, uncertain of the etiquette of this situation. "Can I help?" "You can tell me what brings a woman alone from Missouri to Jerome, Arizona territory, with nothing but a mule and a wagon load of belongings." So Grace told him about her Aunt Martha, about the deed, about the broken engagement and the suffocating life she had been expected to lead. Frank listened while he cooked, asking occasional questions that showed he was genuinely interested rather than just being polite. When he set 2 plates on the table and sat down across from her, Grace realized with some surprise that she felt more comfortable here in this stranger's home than she had felt in months in Missouri. "Your aunt must have been quite a woman," Frank said, cutting into his steak. "Not many women come out here alone, let alone stay. Did you know her, Martha Dalton? The name sounds familiar. What did the deed say about the property?" Grace had the paperwork in her bag, and she retrieved it to show Frank. He studied it carefully, his expression growing thoughtful. "This is a plot on the north side of Jerome, up near the mines. It is not much land, but it has a house on it, or it did 5 years ago when I was last through there. You know Jerome? I sell cattle to the mining companies. Jerome is booming right now, copper and silver. Lots of miners means lots of mouths to feed." He handed the papers back. "What are you planning to do once you get there? Jerome is not an easy town. It is rough, full of miners and gamblers and people looking to make a quick fortune." "I am going to make a life," Grace said firmly. "Whatever that looks like. Maybe I will sell the property or maybe I will stay. I have not decided yet, but it will be my decision, not someone else's." Frank studied her across the table and Grace met his gaze steadily. Finally, he nodded. "Fair enough. But you should know what you are getting into. Jerome sits on the side of a mountain. They call it the wickedest town in the West, and that is probably not an exaggeration. If you go there, you need to be prepared." "I am prepared for whatever comes." "Are you prepared to give up on it if it is not what you hoped?" The question caught Grace off guard. "What do you mean?" Frank leaned back in his chair. "I mean that sometimes the thing we think we want is not actually what we need. Sometimes the journey really does end before we reach the destination we planned." "That sounds like you are trying to convince me not to go to Jerome." "I am trying to convince you to keep your options open, but you seem like the stubborn type who has to learn things the hard way." There was no criticism in his voice, just observation and maybe a hint of respect. They finished dinner in companionable silence, and afterward Frank showed Grace how to bank the fire in the guest room's small fireplace. "If you need anything, I am just across the house. We rise early here, but you sleep as long as you need. Tomorrow will be a long day if we are retrieving your wagon." Grace thanked him and retreated to the guest room, closing the door and leaning against it. She had expected many things on this journey, but she had not expected Frank Dawson. He was not like the men she had known in Missouri, all polished manners and hidden condescension. He was direct and practical, but there was a warmth underneath that she found herself drawn to despite her determination to remain independent. She climbed into bed and tried to sleep, but her mind kept turning over the evening's conversations. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed of red mountains and blue-green eyes. Morning came early on the Triple D ranch. Grace woke to the sound of roosters and men's voices outside, and when she emerged from the guest room, she found Frank already up and making coffee. He looked surprised to see her. "I thought you would sleep longer after your journey." "I am used to early mornings," Grace said. "My aunt ran a boarding house, and I helped her for years. 5 in the morning was sleeping in." Frank poured her a cup of coffee and handed it to her with something that might have been approval in his eyes. "Then you are tougher than most people give you credit for." "Most people do not give me any credit at all. Their loss." They ate a quick breakfast of eggs and bread, then Frank saddled 2 horses while Pete examined Bessie's hoof. The older man looked up as they approached. "She will be fine with a new shoe and a few days' rest." "I will get her fixed up today." "Thank you," Grace said sincerely. Pete just nodded and went back to his work. Frank helped Grace mount one of the horses, a gentle mare named Daisy, and they set out toward where she had left her wagon. The morning was cool and beautiful, the desert landscape painted in shades of gold by the rising sun. Frank rode easily beside her, pointing out landmarks and explaining the territory in a way that felt like sharing rather than lecturing. "That is Mingus Mountain to the west," he said, gesturing toward a peak that rose blue in the distance. "Jerome is on the other side on the Black Hills. Everything you see here is cattle country, though it is harder than it looks. We run about 5,000 head across 20 sections of land, and it takes every bit of that space to support them." "How long have you had the ranch?" "I built it 7 years ago, when I was 23. Came out here from Texas with nothing but a horse and a dream, same as half the people in this territory." He glanced at her. "I understand the pull of starting over somewhere new, but I also understand that starting over does not mean you have to do it alone." Grace did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They rode on until they reached her wagon, still sitting where she had left it, undisturbed. Frank examined it carefully, checking the wheels and the contents Grace had covered with canvas. "This is a good wagon," he said. "Well built. And you pack smart. Not too heavy, but you have what you need." He looked at her. "Did you do this yourself?" "I did. The lawyer tried to tell me what I would need, but I did my own research. I read everything I could find about traveling west and outfitting a wagon." Frank actually smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look younger and more approachable. "You continue to surprise me, Grace Dalton." They hitched the wagon to Frank's horse and led it slowly back to the ranch, arriving around midday. Pete had Bessie shoed and resting comfortably in one of the corrals, and he helped them unload the wagon into the barn for safekeeping. "I have been thinking," Frank said as they finished. "It is too late in the day to start for Jerome now, and your mule needs at least another day of rest before she can handle that mountain road. Why do not you stay one more night, and we will head out first thing the day after tomorrow? I need to deliver cattle to Jerome anyway, so I will ride with you and make sure you get there safely." Grace's first instinct was to refuse, to insist she could manage on her own. But she had learned enough in her weeks of travel to know when accepting help was wisdom rather than weakness. "I appreciate that. Thank you." The rest of that day passed in a way Grace had not experienced in years. Frank gave her a tour of the ranch, introducing her to his small crew of ranch hands who all treated her with respect and curiosity, rather than the condescension she had grown used to. She met the horses, admired the cattle from a safe distance, and even helped Pete repair a section of fence that had come loose, much to both men's surprise. "I worked on my aunt's boarding house," Grace explained, hammering a nail into place with more skill than they expected. I learned to fix things because we could not afford to hire someone every time something broke. That evening, Frank invited her to sit on the porch with him to watch the sunset. The sky put on a spectacular show, turning the clouds pink and orange and purple, and Grace felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for as long as she could remember. "This is beautiful," she said softly. "It is why I stay," Frank replied. "I could probably make more money somewhere else, running a bigger operation or selling out to one of the big ranching companies. But this place, this view, this life, it is enough." "Do you ever get lonely?" The question was out before Grace could stop it, too personal and revealing. But Frank did not seem offended. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun sink below the horizon. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I have the ranch hands and Pete has been with me since the beginning, but it is not the same as having someone to share it all with. Someone who chooses to be here, not because they are paid to be, but because they want to be." He looked at her then, and there was something in his eyes that made Grace's heart beat faster. "What about you? Do you get lonely?" "I have been lonely for years," Grace said honestly. "Even when I was surrounded by people. Maybe especially then. Everyone wanted me to be something I was not, and it was exhausting. At least alone on the trail, I could be myself. Maybe the trick is finding people who let you be yourself. Or finding a place where being yourself is not just accepted but valued." Grace thought about that as the stars began to appear overhead. The air was cooling rapidly, the way it did in the desert, and Frank went inside to get a blanket that he draped over her shoulders without asking. The gesture was casual but intimate, and Grace found herself very aware of him standing behind her, his hands lingering for just a moment on the blanket before he stepped away. They talked long into the night, about everything and nothing. Frank told her about building the ranch, about the struggles of the early years and the satisfaction of watching it grow. Grace told him about her Aunt Martha, about the books she loved to read, about her dreams of independence that now seemed more complicated than they had when she left Missouri. "Dreams are allowed to change," Frank said. "That does not make them less valid. What if I do not know what I want anymore? Then you take time to figure it out, but you do not have to figure it out alone." The next day followed a similar pattern. Grace found herself falling into the rhythm of ranch life easily, helping where she could and learning about this new world she had stumbled into. Frank was patient and encouraging, showing her how to read the cattle's behavior, how to spot a horse that was favoring a leg, how to predict the weather by watching the sky and smelling the air. "You are a good teacher," Grace said in the afternoon, as they stood by a corral watching a new foal try out its legs. "You are a good student. You pay attention and you are not afraid to try things." Frank leaned against the fence rail beside her. "Most people who come out here are either too stubborn to learn or too scared to try. You are neither." "I am definitely stubborn. About the big things, maybe, but not about the details. That is different." Grace watched the foal, which had finally managed to stand and was now nursing from its mother. "I have been thinking about what you said, about how sometimes the journey ends before the destination we planned. And I do not know if I am ready to give up on Jerome yet. I need to see it, see the property, understand what my aunt built before she died. But I also understand what you are suggesting." Frank turned to look at her, and Grace made herself meet his eyes. They were very close, and she could see flecks of gold in the blue-green of his irises. "What am I suggesting? That maybe I could stay here on the ranch with you." The words came out barely above a whisper, but they hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. "Would that be so terrible?" Frank asked softly. "No," Grace said, and realized she meant it. "But I need to see Jerome first. I need to finish what I started, even if the ending is different than I planned." Frank nodded slowly. "Then tomorrow we ride to Jerome and you see your aunt's property and make your decision with all the information. Whatever you choose, I will respect it." That night, Grace lay awake in the guest room, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. She had come west looking for independence, for a chance to make her own choices and live her own life. But somewhere along the way, her understanding of what that meant had shifted. Independence did not have to mean isolation. Making her own choices did not mean refusing all help or connection. And maybe, just maybe, the life she had been searching for was not in Jerome at all, but right here on this ranch with a man who saw her for who she was and valued her for it. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect for traveling. Grace dressed carefully, braiding her hair and putting on her sturdiest dress. When she emerged, Frank had her wagon ready, Bessie hitched and looking much better after her rest. He had also loaded supplies, she noticed, including fresh water and food for the journey. "Ready?" he asked, and Grace nodded. They set out in the early morning light, Frank riding beside her wagon on his horse. The journey to Jerome took most of the day, climbing into the mountains through increasingly rugged terrain. Frank had been right about the road being difficult, full of steep grades and tight switchbacks that would have been treacherous alone. But with him leading the way, pointing out hazards and helping her navigate the worst sections, Grace felt safe. As they climbed higher, the landscape changed. Pine trees replaced desert scrub, and the air grew cooler and thinner. Frank pointed out deer and elk, and once they saw a black bear in the distance, ambling through the trees without concern for the humans passing below. Jerome started as a mining camp, Frank explained as they rode. Copper, mostly, though there is silver too. The United Verd mine is one of the richest in the territory. That means money flowing through the town, but it also means all the problems that come with boom towns. Gambling, drinking, fighting. It is not a gentle place. Grace could see what he meant as the town came into view. Jerome clung to the side of Cleopatra Hill like it had been thrown there and stuck. Buildings climbed the steep slope at odd angles, connected by stairs and boardwalks. Even from a distance, Grace could hear the noise of the place, the stamp mills crushing ore, the shouts of miners, the general chaos of a town growing too fast to keep up with itself. Frank led her to the north side of town, where the buildings were slightly less crowded and the noise marginally quieter. Using the deed as a guide, they found the property that had belonged to Martha Dalton. Grace's first sight of her inheritance made her heart sink. The house was small and weathered, its paint long since surrendered to the elements. The roof sagged ominously in one corner, and several windows were broken. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and what might once have been a vegetable garden was now indistinguishable from the surrounding scrubland. Frank dismounted and helped Grace down from her wagon. They approached the house together, and Frank tested the front door carefully before pushing it open. Inside was dark and musty, filled with the accumulated dust of abandonment. There was furniture, but it was basic and worn. The kitchen had a stove, but no evidence that anyone had cooked there in months. The bedroom was tiny, barely large enough for the narrow bed it contained. Grace walked through the house in silence, her dreams of what she might find crumbling with each step. This was not the new beginning she had imagined. This was not anything she could build a life from, not alone, not without more resources than she possessed. The property itself might be worth something, Frank said gently. Land in Jerome is valuable right now. You could sell it and use the money to start over somewhere else. Somewhere like your ranch. Grace heard the bitterness in her own voice and hated it. If that is what you want. But only if it is really what you want, Grace. not because you feel like you have no other choice. Grace walked out of the house and stood in the overgrown yard, looking down at the town of Jerome sprawling below her. She could see the mines, the massive operations that were tearing copper and silver out of the mountain. She could see the saloons and gambling halls, the rough men on the streets, the general air of barely controlled chaos. This was the destination she had been aiming for, the goal that had carried her through weeks of difficult travel, and she did not want it at all. "I think I have been running toward the wrong thing," she said when Frank came to stand beside her. "I thought I wanted independence, and I thought independence meant being alone, being completely self-sufficient. But that is not it at all. I wanted to matter. I wanted to be valued for who I am, not what someone else wanted me to be." "And do you feel valued at the ranch?" Grace turned to face him fully. Frank was watching her with those blue-green eyes that seemed to see right through her defenses, but there was no pressure in his gaze, no demand for a particular answer. He was simply asking, giving her the space to figure out her own truth. "Yes," she said, "I do. These past few days have felt more real, more right than anything in my life for as long as I can remember, and I think you feel it too." Frank stepped closer, reaching out to take her hand. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip gentle but sure. "I do feel it. I have felt it since I found you by the creek. But I did not want to push you, did not want you to feel trapped or obligated. You have spent your whole life with people telling you what you should do, and I will not be another one of those people." "Then do not tell me what I should do," Grace said, her heart pounding. "Tell me what you want. I want you to stay. I want you to come back to the ranch with me and see if this thing between us is as real as it feels. I want to wake up every morning knowing you are there, that I get to see you and talk to you and learn everything about you. I want to teach you about ranching and learn about all the things you know that I do not. I want to build something with you, not just a ranch but a life." He paused, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "But only if that is what you want too." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, tears of relief and recognition. "It is what I want. God help me. I have known you for 3 days, and it is already what I want." Frank pulled her closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Then the journey ends right here, Grace Dalton. Not in this town, not in this house, but right here in this moment when you choose something different than what you planned. When you choose us." When he kissed her, it felt like coming home. Not the home she had left behind in Missouri, with all its expectations and limitations, but a new home built on mutual respect and genuine connection. Grace wrapped her arms around Frank's neck and kissed him back, pouring all her hope and fear and desire into it, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "We should probably make this official before we do anything else," Frank said, his forehead resting against hers. "I am a respectable rancher after all," Grace laughed, the sound bright and free. "Are you proposing to me, Frank Dawson?" "I am, unless you think 3 days is too soon to know you want to spend your life with someone. I think 3 days can be enough if they are the right 3 days. And I think I knew the moment you rode down into that canyon that my life was about to change." She pulled back enough to look at him properly. "Yes, I will marry you, but I need to do something first." Frank raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" "I need to sell this property and arrange my aunt's affairs properly. She deserves that much. And I need to send a letter back to Missouri, letting them know I am staying in Arizona territory, just to close that door officially." "That is fair. We can handle all of that from Jerome before we head back. There is a land office and a telegraph station." Frank kissed her forehead. "And when we get back to the ranch, we will start planning a wedding. Nothing fancy, but something real." They spent the rest of the day in Jerome, and Grace got a better sense of the town as they walked through it. Frank was right that it was rough, but it was also vibrant and alive in a way that was exciting even if it was not where she wanted to live. They found a lawyer who handled the sale of Martha's property to a mining company looking to expand their operations. The price was better than Grace had expected, enough to give her a solid financial foundation for her new life. At the telegraph office, Grace composed a careful message to the lawyer in St. Louis, letting him know she was staying in Arizona territory and would not be returning. She hesitated before adding a line about her engagement, then decided to include it. Let them know she had found happiness on her own terms. Feel better? Frank asked as they left the telegraph office. I do. It feels like closing one chapter and starting another. Grace looked up at the man who would be her husband and felt a surge of joy so pure it almost hurt. A better chapter. They spent the night in Jerome at a respectable boarding house, in separate rooms because Frank insisted on doing things properly even though they both knew they would rather be together. In the morning, they loaded Grace's belongings back into her wagon and began the journey back to the Triple D Ranch. The trip felt different this time. Grace was not heading into unknown territory but toward home, and the difference was profound. She pointed out things Frank had shown her before, demonstrating what she had learned, and he corrected her gently when she got details wrong and praised her when she got them right. You are going to be a natural at this, he said as they descended back into the lower country where the ranch sat. Pete is going to love having another competent person around. Just Pete, Frank grinned at her. I already love having you around. Pete will just be grateful for the help. When they arrived back at the ranch, Pete was indeed waiting for them, and Grace was surprised to see several other men with him. Frank had sent word ahead, she realized, and these were the other ranch hands coming to meet the woman who would be their boss's wife. This is Grace Dalton, Frank announced, helping her down from the wagon. We are getting married, probably as soon as we can get a preacher out here. I expect you all to treat her with respect and make her feel welcome. The men, about 6 of them in total, all nodded and introduced themselves. They ranged in age from a boy who could not have been more than 18 to a grizzled older man who looked like he had been cowboying since before Grace was born. All of them seemed genuinely pleased about the news, and Grace realized that they cared about Frank and wanted to see him happy. Welcome to the Triple D, Mrs. Dalton, the grizzled cowboy said, and Grace smiled. It is still Miss Dalton for now, but thank you, and please call me Grace. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Frank sent word to a circuit preacher who agreed to come perform the ceremony, and Grace threw herself into making the ranch house ready. She scrubbed and cleaned, rearranged furniture, and added touches from her wagon that made the space feel more like a home. She also started learning the business of ranching in earnest, riding out with Frank and the hands to check on the cattle, helping with fence repairs, and even learning to throw a rope. You are good at this, Pete told her one afternoon as they worked on fixing a water trough. Most city folks never really take to ranch life, but you are natural. I am not sure how natural I am, Grace said, wiping sweat from her forehead, but I am willing to learn and I am not afraid of hard work. That is all that matters out here, that and being able to stand the isolation. Some people go crazy with nothing but sky and cattle for company. I think I prefer it to being surrounded by people who never really see you. Pete nodded thoughtfully. The boss is a good man. He deserves someone who appreciates this life and appreciates him. I do appreciate him. More than I knew how to say. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late September, 6 weeks after Grace had first arrived at the ranch. The preacher was an old man who had been riding the circuit for 30 years, and he performed the ceremony in the ranch yard with the mountains as a backdrop, and the ranch hands as witnesses. Grace wore a simple dress she had altered from her aunt's belongings, adding lace she found in the bottom of a trunk. Frank wore his best clothes, which were still practical ranch wear but clean and pressed. "Do you, Frank Dawson, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the preacher asked. "I do," Frank said firmly, looking at Grace like she was the only person in the world. "And do you, Grace Dalton, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Grace said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Frank did, pulling Grace close and kissing her thoroughly while the ranch hands cheered and whistled. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling so hard their faces hurt. Pete had organized a celebration, and there was food and music and dancing under the stars. Grace danced with Frank, with Pete, with each of the ranch hands who wanted to congratulate her. She felt more alive and more herself than she ever had in her life, surrounded by people who accepted her without reservation. Later, when the celebration had wound down and the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse, Frank carried Grace across the threshold of their home. He set her down gently in their bedroom, which Grace had spent days making perfect, with new curtains and the best linen she could find in Jerome. "Hello, Mrs. Dawson," Frank said, pulling her close. "Hello, Mr. Dawson," Grace replied, reaching up to undo his collar. "I believe we have some unfinished business." Their wedding night was everything Grace had hoped and nothing she expected, tender and passionate and full of discovery. Frank was patient and attentive, making sure she felt safe and cherished. Grace gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back, and found joy she had not known existed. Afterward, lying in Frank's arms with her head on his chest, Grace listened to his heartbeat and felt peace settle over her like a blessing. No regrets. Frank asked softly, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "Not a single one. This is exactly where I am supposed to be." The first year of their marriage was hard work but deeply satisfying. Grace learned ranching thoroughly, becoming as comfortable on horseback as Frank was. She took over managing the household accounts and discovered she had a head for business that helped the ranch become more profitable. She also started corresponding with other ranch wives in the territory, building a network of friends who understood the unique challenges and rewards of this life. Frank had been right about her being a natural. Grace loved the work, loved the sense of accomplishment that came from seeing tangible results of her efforts. She loved riding out at dawn to check on the cattle, loved the quiet moments watching the sun set over the mountains, loved falling into bed exhausted at the end of a long day, and waking up next to the man. She loved to do it all over again. They had their disagreements, of course. Grace was stubborn and had opinions about how things should be done, and Frank had his own ways of doing things that he had perfected over years. But they learned to talk through their differences, to compromise and find solutions that worked for both of them. And making up after an argument was something they both enjoyed immensely. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Grace realized she was pregnant. She waited to tell Frank until she was sure, then chose her moment carefully. They were sitting on the porch one evening, as they often did, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Frank," she said softly, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her with immediate concern. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong. Everything is very, very right." She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby." Frank stared at her for a long moment, then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight enough that she squeaked in protest. "Sorry," he said, loosening his grip but not letting go. "I am just so happy. You are sure?" "I am sure. I think it will be early winter, probably December." "A Christmas baby," Frank said, wonder in his voice. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You have made me the happiest man alive, Grace Dawson." The pregnancy was not easy. Grace was sick for the first 3 months, and Frank hovered over her like a worried hen, much to her amusement and occasional irritation. But as she started to show and the sickness faded, she felt better than she had in her life. She continued working on the ranch as long as she could, until Frank and Pete conspired to keep her closer to the house. "I am pregnant, not an invalid," she protested. "You are carrying my child," Frank said firmly, "and I will not risk either of you. Please, Grace, let us help." She agreed, mainly because she could see how much it meant to him, but she found ways to stay useful. She took over more of the paperwork, started a garden that would provide vegetables for the ranch, and even began teaching the youngest ranch hand to read and write when she discovered he had never learned. In December, 3 weeks before Christmas, Grace went into labor. Frank sent Pete riding for the midwife in Jerome while he stayed with Grace, holding her hand and trying to hide his fear. The midwife arrived just in time, and after hours of hard labor, Grace delivered a healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's determination. "What should we name him?" Frank asked, cradling his son with a tenderness that made Grace's heart overflow. "I was thinking Matthew," Grace said. "Matthew Dawson. It means gift of God, and that is what he is." "Matthew Dawson," Frank repeated, testing the name. "It is perfect. He is perfect." "You are perfect." They brought Matthew home from Jerome 2 days later, and the ranch hands all came to meet the newest addition to the Triple D family. Pete carved a cradle from pine wood, and one of the other hands' wives brought over baby clothes her own children had outgrown. Grace was touched by the generosity and care of their community. The first year of Matthew's life was exhausting but joyful. Grace had never known she could love someone as fiercely as she loved her son, unless it was the way she loved Frank when she watched him with their baby. He was a natural father, patient and playful, and Matthew clearly adored him. When Matthew was 2, Grace became pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy was easier. In the summer of 1880, she delivered twin girls, Emily and Sarah, both healthy and loud and perfect. Frank was overwhelmed and delighted in equal measure, and their house suddenly felt much fuller. "We might need to add on," Frank said one night, as Grace nursed the twins while Matthew played at their feet. "This house was built for a bachelor, not a family." "I think that is a wonderful idea," Grace agreed. "Maybe a bigger bedroom for us and a separate room for Matthew now that he is getting older." They spent the next year expanding the house, adding rooms and making it truly their home. Grace decorated with care, mixing practical furnishings with little touches of beauty, making a space that was comfortable and welcoming. The ranch continued to prosper, and Frank hired more hands to help with the increased workload. Matthew grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved helping his father with the ranch work. The twins were identical in appearance, but opposite in temperament. Emily quiet and observant, while Sarah was bold and adventurous. Grace loved watching them grow, seeing pieces of herself and Frank in each of them. When the twins were 3 and Matthew was 5, Grace realized she was pregnant again. She laughed when she told Frank, seeing the mixture of joy and alarm on his face. "4 children," he said. "We are going to need a bigger house again. Or we could just accept that we are a large family and make do," Grace said, kissing him. "I love our life, Frank. I love our children and our home and everything we have built together. I love it too. I love you." He placed his hand on her stomach. "And I will love this one just as much as the others." Their 4th child, a boy they named Jacob, was born in the spring of 1883. He was the easiest of all their babies, calm and content, and he fit into their family perfectly. Grace was 30 years old and happier than she had ever dreamed possible. The years passed quickly, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the milestones of their growing children. Matthew proved to have his father's gift with horses and his mother's head for business. The twins grew into beautiful, capable young women. Emily with a talent for healing that had her helping birth calves and tend to sick animals, while Sarah had a gift for training the wildest horses. Jacob was still young but showed signs of being the most artistic of all of them, always drawing or building things with whatever materials he could find. Grace looked around their dinner table one night, when Matthew was 12 and Jacob was 6, and felt overwhelming gratitude. This life, this family, this home, it was everything she had been searching for when she left Missouri so many years ago. She had thought she was heading toward independence and self-sufficiency, toward a solitary life of her own making. Instead, she had found partnership and love, community and purpose. "What are you thinking about?" Frank asked, noticing her expression. "I am thinking about how different my life is from what I planned, how much better it is." Frank reached across the table to take her hand, his touch still sending warmth through her after all these years. "I am glad you let the journey end here." "I am glad you convinced me it should," Grace replied. "Though I think you know I did not take much convincing. I knew from that first night what I wanted. I just needed to see Jerome to be sure." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had stayed?" Grace shook her head. "Not even once. This is where I belong, with you, with our children on this ranch. This is home." That night, after the children were all in bed and the house was quiet, Frank and Grace sat on their porch as they had countless times over the years. The view never got old, the mountains dark against the star-filled sky, the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night all around them. "Do you remember that first night you stayed here?" Frank asked. "When I told you that sometimes the journey ends before the destination we planned. I remember everything about that night. I knew even then. I knew you were the one I had been waiting for. I just had to hope you would figure it out too." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "I am so grateful I did, and I am grateful every day that you rode down into that canyon and convinced me there was another way. I did not convince you of anything. You convinced yourself. I just gave you the space to see it." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the stars come out one by one. Grace thought about the young woman she had been, traveling alone across the country with nothing but hope and determination. She thought about how terrified she had been, how uncertain, how convinced that she had to do everything alone or it did not count. She had been so wrong about so many things. Strength was not about doing everything alone. It was about knowing when to accept help, when to let people in, when to change course based on new information. Independence was not about isolation. It was about making your own choices, and Grace had chosen Frank, had chosen this life, with full knowledge and complete freedom. "I love you," she said softly. "I love you too," Frank replied. Every day more than the day before. As the years continued to pass, the Triple D Ranch grew and prospered. Matthew married a girl from Jerome when he was 20, bringing her back to the ranch and building a house just down the hill from the main house. Emily went to nursing school in Phoenix and came back to serve the ranching community as their primary medical help. Sarah married one of the ranch hands and took over training all the horses. Jacob went to university in California, studying architecture, but came back every summer and eventually returned permanently to help design and build improvements to the ranch. Frank and Grace became grandparents, then grandparents many times over. Their children gave them a dozen grandchildren between them, all growing up on the ranch or nearby, all learning the values of hard work and family that Frank and Grace had instilled in their own children. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered for a celebration. There was food and music and dancing, just like their wedding day, but so much bigger and fuller. Grace looked around at the sea of faces, all the people who existed because she had chosen to stop in that canyon instead of pushing on to Jerome, and felt overwhelming emotion. Frank found her standing alone for a moment, watching the party, and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Dawson." "Happy anniversary, Mr. Dawson." She turned in his arms to face him. "Thank you for convincing me the journey ends right here." "Thank you for being convinced," Frank said, and kissed her while their children and grandchildren cheered. Grace was 50 when Frank started slowing down. It was nothing dramatic, just a gradual reduction in his energy, a little more gray in his hair, a little more stiffness in his movements. She slowed down with him, both of them gradually turning over more of the ranch operations to their children while still remaining involved and active. They had more time for each other, for long talks on the porch, for rides through the ranch land they both loved. They traveled a little, visiting Jerome occasionally to see how much it had changed, and once going back to Missouri, so Grace could show Frank where she had come from. But they were always happy to return home, to the Triple D ranch that had become the center of their world. When Grace was 55 and Frank was 62, he had a heart attack while out checking on the cattle. Matthew and Sarah got him back to the house, and Emily did everything she could, but they all knew it was serious. Frank recovered, but he was weaker after that, more fragile. "I am not ready to lose you," Grace said one night, lying next to him in their bed. "You are not going to lose me," Frank said, pulling her close. "I am going to be around annoying you for years yet." He was true to his word. Frank lived another 8 years, seeing grandchildren married and great-grandchildren born. He walked Emily down the aisle when she finally married at 40. He taught Jacob's son how to gentle a horse with nothing but patience and soft words. He sat on the porch with Grace every evening, holding her hand and watching the sunset over the mountains they both loved, when Frank died peacefully in his sleep at 70. Surrounded by family, Grace grieved deeply, but without regret. They had built a beautiful life together, raised wonderful children, created a legacy that would continue for generations. She stayed on the ranch, still involved in its operations, still teaching the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, still sitting on the porch every evening even though Frank was not there beside her. Grace lived to be 81, sharp and active until nearly the end. On her last evening, she sat on the porch with Matthew, now a gray-haired man in his 50s himself, and looked out at the view she had loved for over 50 years. "I am ready," she told him. "I have had a wonderful life, more than I ever dreamed possible, and I am ready to see your father again." "He has been waiting for you," Matthew said, tears in his eyes. "We all know that." Grace patted his hand. "Take care of the ranch, take care of each other. And remember that sometimes the best thing you can do is let the journey end before you reach the destination you planned." She died that night in her sleep, in the bedroom she had shared with Frank for over 40 years, in the house they had built together, on the land they had loved. Her children and grandchildren mourned her, but also celebrated a life well lived, a love story for the ages, and a legacy that would continue through all the generations that came after. The Triple D Ranch continued to thrive, passed down through Grace and Frank's descendants, each generation adding their own touches but maintaining the core values the founders had established. And every evening, someone from the family would sit on that porch and watch the sunset over the mountains, remembering the woman who had been heading west alone, and the rancher who had convinced her the journey ended right there, and the beautiful life they had built together in the process.